welcome to our discussion today on John Wesley and the Industrial Revolution. To help us in this discussion, we have two experts with us. First, we have Jennifer Woodruff Tait, who is the editor of the Christian History magazine and also the priest of St. John's Episcopal Church. And joining with her is Charlie Self, a professor of Christian history and long-term pastor. So we look forward to our time to engage each other today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wesley lived, preached, and ministered in a time of great upheaval during the Industrial Revolution. There was social dislocation caused by the Industrial Revolution, roughly 1740 to 1840s or so. So Jennifer, can you help us understand a little bit, like why was this so dislocating? Why was this period of time so dislocating?
There were a number of changes in both the kind of work that was done and where it was done. Before that, although obviously people have been moving from farms to cities since time immemorial, but a lot of work was still done in the home, on the farm. England was quite rural, and now you have people going to towns, going to cities, doing the sorts of things that eventually become, by the turn of the 20th century, fully mechanized factories, also going to offices. Nobody went to an office in 1700. And there becomes a greater division of labor between men and women because the men many times are going outside the home. There's also the question of child and female labor. Sometimes women and children are laboring in factories.
Right.
And there's much more of a sense of not a unitive product of something you might produce in a home, whether that's farming your field or making clothes or whatever, but producing bits of things on what become eventually full-flowered assembly lines.
Right. So you don't have quite the satisfaction you may on the farm where you produce products, from beginning to end and get to market that. Well, Wesley was born into this context, shaped by it, and he both ministered into it, and he saw the potential good use of money as well as some of the dangers behind it. So Charlie, how did Wesley respond in positive ways to these dislocations in the Industrial Revolution?
Well, Wesley was interested in science and technology, interested in human knowledge expanding. And so the opportunity to improve processes, making goods available to a greater number of people, the increase in wealth, Wesley saw its dangers, of course, and we'll be talking about that, but he also saw the opportunity for ethical entrepreneurship. He saw the opportunity for people to better their financial situation. And something else about the Industrial Revolution we forget, and we have to look at the social upheaval, but we forget that it begins a period of time we're still in, which is the greatest expansion of wealth and opportunity in global history. Just in my own lifetime, almost 3 billion people have come out of poverty. And that process begins early in this moment and only accelerates in the 20th century. Wesley would have responded positively to the opportunity, but he also would have responded prophetically to the dislocations and difficulties that people encountered.
Yeah, so there's basically two different pictures here, aren't there? So Jennifer, maybe help us a little bit understand like some of the social problems that were created during this Industrial Revolution, because these problems, some were directly a cause, some were indirectly caused by that. But what are some of the major issues that were created?
Well, some of the things that are often, the Industrial Revolution is often critiqued for is increasing poverty. I know what Charlie just said, so let me explain myself, that a lot of times people moved from rural areas to cities, and the cities were not prepared. They lived in crowded housing. Yeah. The parish system in the Church of England was very rural, was not set up to, maybe there was a thriving parish that was assisting people where they came from, but not where they were going to. There was, as I said earlier, a need sometimes for women and children to labor in some fairly degrading ways. There was also, and this is a rather minor criticism, but it's the one Wesley spent the most time on, increased alcoholism. Because there was a lot of cheap gin going around in cities. People were drinking it. They were getting drunk. There was tons of societal upheaval caused from that. And Wesley responded very strongly to that. He critiqued the liquor traffic, and he also wrote and pastored sort of individually dealing with the drunkards and what caused people to become addicted to alcohol and bringing grace into that. Good. But all of those were things that were disruptive and really required a church response that in some cases the Church of England was not well providing.
Very good. So some would say that the gin of that time could be equated with like opioids right now.
Yes, that's an excellent metaphor.
Good. Well, thank you. So the Industrial Revolution also started this process of innovation and wealth creation that produced great benefits to society. So Charlie, give us the other side a little bit. What are some of these benefits to society that were birthed in this time?
You know, as a historian, there's always a danger of extreme focus on the individual deprivation, and we have to keep that. And there's also an equal danger of looking at what the Annales School in France calls the longue durée, or the long view that almost ignores all the dislocations that my colleague is talking about. And so Wesley would have seen both. But the positive impact of the Industrial Revolution in terms of structures, in terms of culture, let me just share a couple of things. One is you have the economic engines behind universal education. You have the economic engines behind cultural expansion. More people from more classes are now going to be exposed to the arts, to music, to public events that were previously only the preserve of the aristocracy. And even in universities, we have this explosion in the 19th and 20th century of both public and private institutions that could only come about because of the wealth creation. That said, it doesn't change those significant dislocations and sufferings, but it does help us begin to see a trend that's important to understand.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you. So the Protestant work ethic has been defined by some as a problem and others as a virtue. So again, we're like two sides of a coin. So Jennifer, help us understand a little bit, what are some of the negative results or implications of the Protestant work ethic?
Well, the one that it gets critiqued for most often is the workaholism of today's society. The idea that meaning is found in our jobs, but the idea that meaning is found only in your job and only in work outside the home. The lack of an adequate sort of rhythm of home and work life. A lot of that gets laid on the Industrial Revolution and gets laid on Wesley in particular, and it gets laid on his sermon, The Use of Money, which is probably one of his most famous sermons because it's the one where he said, earn all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. And Wesley, of course, what he was most interested in was the giving. He was most interested in the fact that the people in the Methodist movement should be industrious so that they would have ways to assist others and to help with all the dislocating things that he saw. But a lot of people in his own day got stuck on the first two. He called that out in the sermon, and they still got stuck. And a lot of people from then on have gotten stuck, and people have pointed back and said, well, see, it's all Wesley's fault because he said you should work all you can. Well, that's not the whole story.
Yeah. I think Wesley assumed that they would do like he did, right? So he made like $5 to $6 million in today's terms in his business, but he didn't. When he died, he had none of it left. So he assumed that they would do that third, but not necessarily. Well, Charlie, based on Wesley's own response, what were some of the positive aspects and results of the Protestant work ethic based upon what Wesley portrayed for them?
Well, and let's take Protestant work ethic to include the virtues and blessings of all the streams of the Reformation. Max Weber's concept is a narrow concept, but every stream of the Reformation, Catholic, Anglican, Anabaptist, Lutheran, Reformed, all began to look at daily work in new ways. The church has struggled through her whole history between the sacred and secular dichotomy of those called to religious vocation, which all of us would respect deeply, and those called to what Bernard Ram called in one class I was in, the garden variety life. Well, biblically, every person is called to worship and work in a seamless way. And the Reformation streams helped bring that back into focus, and Wesley in particular empowered lay workers. He saw them as critical to the mission of God in the world, and their workplace, to borrow Mark Green's term, was the front line of that mission. So for Wesley, he really helps us reintegrate what so often we disintegrate. And so now work becomes an expression of worship. And of course, there's always the danger of idolatry. And that's really what Jen was talking about, is this danger of just looking for how you're amassing wealth, whereas for Wesley and for all of the reformers, it was an opportunity to glorify God in serving your neighbor.
Very good. Well, one reason that Wesley's attractive is that he's kind of like a boots dirty kind of guy, like hands-on, blue collar, among the poor, etc., which is different than some others that have spoken about this topic. And his focus on the poor in particular inspired other contemporaries like Arthur Guinness and the Lever Brothers and Cadbury and Wedgwood. So, Charlie, I'll come back to you on this one. how does his example inspire and encourage social entrepreneurs for today? In other words, what would he say to social entrepreneurs today to encourage or inspire them?
Well, what's interesting is we think of social entrepreneurship or social enterprise as a modern construct.
Right.
Wesley would use different terms, but he would talk about glorifying God and how you go about creating the conditions for everyone to flourish. And so just to use your examples, whether it's a Cadbury or a Wedgwood or a Guinness, these folks care about the working conditions of their employees. They give opportunities for education. They care about, they know that healthy employees are going to be productive employees.
Right.
So this idea of a triple bottom line, this idea that we can we can make a profit, care for people, care for the planet. Wesley would have used other terms. He would have talked about stewarding the goodness of God's providential resources, of stewarding the opportunities well, especially in generosity. And I think it's a great template to build with new language perhaps and with new examples in today's gig economy, but we have a chance to build on the same template.
Yeah, so Guinness, I think I read that during the war, he paid half salary for all the spouses and guaranteed all the soldiers when they came back, they still had their job, right? So that's looking at not just a financial bottom line because they actually suffered financially, but it increased social capital and spiritual capital.
And this is something, I want to interject something important here. In today's very polarizing political atmosphere, we forget the power of voluntary sacrifice. We forget the power of what you just described. And this is one of the reasons why a Christ-centered ethos for work and a response to change is so important.
Yeah.
Because if we don't voluntarily divest ourselves and serve others, then someone else will volunteer that for us, and the leviathans that they create aren't going to be nearly as benevolent, aren't going to be nearly as equitable as the ones that were created voluntarily by these Wesley-inspired entrepreneurs.
Yeah, so now you're starting to preach, Charlie. Which, thank you.
Okay, Pastor, guilty.
Speaking of which, Wesley had several sermons that he preached. You mentioned the use of money, but also the dangers of riches. And he saw the positive benefit of money being a good servant, but also the danger of it being a bad master. So, Jennifer, today, what kind of cautions would you give to, say, aspiring business folks or workers? What cautions would you say that Wesley would speak to us today?
Well, I still think it's hard to beat the use of money. And Wesley, like I said, built that caution in. He said this is not about just earning to earn. This is about earning for human flourishing, for the flourishing, So, I would start there. I also think that Wesley gives us some good templates to look at structural inequality and structural economic issues in the way he treated the liquor traffic. He didn't always see the structural issues behind every dislocating thing, but he was really keyed into that on alcoholism and the liquor traffic. And going back and reading his works on that, he was quite clear this was a problem that was not going to be solved by individual drunkards alone getting right with Jesus. Right. It was a problem that was going to be solved by an entire industry taking a good look at itself. Right. And I think there are lessons in that for lots of industries today.
Good. So Wesley used a term like complicated wickedness.
Yes. There's a lot of complicated wickedness out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just tweaking one thing here and there, but there's a whole embedded system that, yes, there is some personal change, but it's also a systemic approach that needs to be looked at. So the Industrial Revolution caused a pivotal shift in the nature of work, the role of workers' conditions, family life, et cetera. And Andy Crouch has said, due to the COVID pandemic, we're seeing a shift now in work, almost similar to a mini ice age. So, Charlie, I'll start with you. What can we learn from Wesley's response in a previous time of upheaval that can help us today as we're experiencing changes like the gig economy, the experience economy, the whole rise of the great resignation, people are leaving the workforce, and then the sharing economies such as like Uber and Airbnb. What can we learn from previous time that can help us navigate through uncertainties we're in right now?
No, I think it's a great question. First of all, for all workers who care about living a God-glorifying life, I'm going to put it in that context because obviously we can't control what dispositions. Character is king. This is why David Wright's great book, How God Makes the World a Better Place,
Yes.
change people, change the world. So we don't want to lose the individual transformation that God brings through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so we would start with character. But then we would move into charisms. Wesley in his movements, in his evangelism, discipleship, church growth, we would call it today, really stressed the fact that people have diverse gifts and need to exercise them, but not only in the church, but in the world as well. So helping people know what their natural and spiritual gifts are. Thirdly, there are new competencies that have to be learned. Wesley loved to devour knowledge, science, theology, medicine. So in fact, when you're asking about the positive effects of the Industrial Revolution, you think about transportation, you think about medicine, what P.J. Hill calls impersonal exchange, getting goods available to more people. If you're a family on a farm, you're making everything on that farm. Now it's parceled out. On one hand, there's something lost. On the other hand, there's something gained, which is you might have clothes every 3 or 4 years instead of every 10 years. So there's just those kinds of changes. So character, charisms, and competencies are all built on the Wesleyan vision of both a transformed person, but also transformed systems. But adaptability would be critical. And Wesley's reliance on the Holy Spirit, not only for individual conversion, but for sanctification and for transformation of the manners of society, we could bring that back into our day and say that the Holy Spirit cares about systemic change.
Yes.
But we should interject, Wesley fought all of his adult life against slavery and against racism. And though he was still subject to class issues sometimes, and there was still some hierarchy in some of the things he said and did, in 1757, he said, no Methodist can own a slave. And no amount of legislation, no matter what the legalists say, can make something wrong right. And so we can be inspired by that example today as we try to remove every barrier to genuine equality and opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. I know on a personal level, I have a handful of small businesses that I operate, and I often refer to Wesley to help me think through some difficult decisions that are gray. And the one you mentioned with the slavery, it points out there's no single bottom line, i.e. profit. So just because you can make profit doesn't mean you should on certain activity. You have to balance that with, and Wesley didn't use these terms, but the social capital, either lost or destroyed or gained, and the spiritual capital as well. Yeah. So I think Wesley has great traction for today. There's both cautions and also examples we can use. And perhaps the last word comes from Charlie. When you wrote this piece, I thought you articulated it well. You said the Wesleyan movement found fragile balance, advocating for better conditions, empowering personal change, and acting for systemic reform. This is the legacy of John Wesley. Paradoxical progress and problems characterizing God's good creation marred by sin and being redeemed through Christ by the Spirit. And here's the last sentence that I really like. Wesley's eschatological vision, his evangelistic zeal, his ethical expectations of Christ's followers, and all-encompassing vision of awakening and the common good continues as a North Star for comprehensiveness and integration. Thank you both for your time with us, for giving us both sides of the coin and having a nuanced discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.